All right, well, welcome everyone to Tuesday Night Theologetics. Glad you're here. I feel like one of those animatronic guys from Chuck E. Cheese or Freddy Fazbear, which I don't know if you know who Freddy Fazbear is. Who knows who Freddy Fazbear is? Anyone? Nobody? Oh, just raise them up. So 2 people, 3 people, you know who Freddy Fazbear is? Okay. My youngest daughter thought that was the coolest creature, and then she realized it was a horror thing, and she got scared of it. But Freddy Fazbear. But anyways, welcome to Tuesday Night Theologetics. We're in God's Undertaker. It's a book by John Lennox. Let me give you a couple announcements. I'll jump into sort of the teaching, what we're doing, and kind of what's coming up, all right? So there's a fun thing. So just coming down the pipe, the podcast has been going well. I'm excited to be an influencer now. And so this has been neat. I'm going to go places and restaurants and be like, hey, do you want to give me free food? And I'll give you a review on my site. I'm just kidding. No, but it's been fun. I think they launched, each one launches yesterday. But if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd urge you to do so. It's a fun chance to do kind of a Q&A. I don't really know what subject's coming up that we're filming this week. I don't know necessarily what it is, but the one we just put up was on borders and the rest. And it's kind of fun to think out loud and go through it. It's a good time. I'm glad we're doing it. The book, I'm hoping this Friday we get the first copy, and then by next week, it'd be really exciting to be able to show you the book, the Mere Membership book that I wrote, and it'll be neat to see if you guys like it. Again, it's written mainly, essentially kind of like to pastors or people that are organizing churches, but you guys are so smart that you'll just like it. It'll feel like candy to you, so it'll be good. And then, like I said, I'm working on the Genesis commentary. My goal, if you guys keep pushing me on it, my goal is to get this finished editing in the next couple months, and then we'll get that out as well. But we'll see. If the Mere Membership gets no traction, who knows what we'll do. But I feel like I want to get it out. So that's coming down the pipe. This Sunday, we're starting Deuteronomy, which is an exciting book that'll get us through the Pentateuch. So my whole picture here is there's just not a lot of great sort of commentaries on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, and especially from sort of an evangelical, robust picture. And so before this Deuteronomy one, if you guys are able to go back and you're interested in doing some homework, my suggestion is go back to Genesis and just listen through those sermons kind of as you work your way up. It'll be neat to see how it comes through because the Pentateuch itself is a completed whole. My goal is we finish the entire Genesis commentary by the time we finish Deuteronomy, and then by next year, Exodus is coming out, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That'd be really fun. So if you can pray for me about that, we'll see what happens there. But I'm really excited about where that looks for the future. And then this next week, midweek, the pastors will be going up to the Shepherds Conference, which is like a thing we do every year. All the speakers and yada yada. It's a good time. Going to meet up with some different folks. I'm teaching an apologetics class in 2027 in New Zealand. I'm a teaching fellow for the Trinity Theological Institute in New Zealand, and so a lot of the material we're doing here will get placed into a class there for credit. So you're like, oh, I'm getting credit. One more thing. So this book, we're about 60% through the book or so. I'm not sure how many endnotes there are. I'm using an electronic version in front of me. I've read the book a couple times. We're teaching through it, but I just don't remember how many chapters there are. Do you know, Bryant, how many chapters there are total? 12? Okay, so yeah, we're at chapter 7 tonight. So we're working our way through, so a few more weeks, and then I'm thinking that the next book I'm going to do is to go back and teach The Attributes of God by Pink. Anyone down for that? Who's excited to hear that? Anybody? So, okay, one person. So, all right, cool. I guess you voted down. I'll go teach something else. You guys don't want to hear the attributes? Okay, that's good. Attributes of God by Pink. Was anyone here when I taught that last time? Who remembers that? That's why I'm doing it again. So that's going to be a really heavy hitting theology kind of thing. And then, that's it. So let me say a quick prayer and we'll jump into this tonight. So God, thank you so much for this book by Lennox. I pray that you would use me to teach well. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so let's kind of think through this book. So let's go remind ourselves what we're doing. So John Lennox wrote this book, God's Undertaker, in 2007 as a response to Richard Dawkins' book that was written in 2006, The God Delusion. And Richard Dawkins was part of the New Atheists, which was a group of essentially evolutionary gradualists, materialists that believed in a gradual step-by-step picture of evolution that kind of repopularized themselves with sort of teeth. Their whole, the thing that made them popular was their bombast. It wasn't scholarship, it was at the popular level a sort of sense of, if you're UFC, it's like the Sean Strickland of atheism, right? They just kind of came out with a lot of offensiveness towards religion and Christianity. And here we are in 2026, like 20 years later, and secularism fully took root in America between 2006 and 2026. And the result, as we were predicting the whole time, because I was teaching through this time period, the result was not a beautiful, wonderful society, but a society that became more religious, just not Christian, because there's no such thing as irreligious people, but it became essentially pagan, which is what we see now. All the politics you saw coming from that era to now became more and more moralistic on both sides and on all sides, where right now the arguments that were given originally for gay marriage, for the rest, talk about things like love and this, that, but now the arguments are made that it's immoral to stand against this. Even the hardcore transgender argument you can come up with, it's whether you agree or disagree with it, none of you probably would agree with it, obviously, but even just understand that the basis for most of the arguments being made are basis of morality. But it's not a morality from the Bible. It's a morality of an asserted, like a romanticism, a morality that's just assumed. And so in that environment, the idea that science would flourish, it became really obviously untrue. So you had guys like Dawkins and Sam Harris and the rest all of a sudden say, you know what? Actually, Christianity is good for society, and we want Christianity to come back in Western society, because for them to argue against Christianity, they needed a culture that had a Christian presupposition that even made arguments something that's worth doing in the first place. Secondly, the thing that's happening at the meantime of this rising sort of religious paganism is the rise of Islam. Islam's been around for a long time, but the immigration policies has created sort of a cultural jihad idea. You've seen this in Europe and other places. And so you've seen in the midst of this religious tendency from everybody, also a geopolitical tendency, which is to say Islam is a geopolitical religion, and so Judaism is a geopolitical religion. Catholicism is a geopolitical religion, and you've seen some Protestants trying to make Christianity more geopolitical, which, again, is a mistaken notion. I think society, what they're going to do is reject all of this wholesale. People are going to get tired of the religious talk in general, and they're going to throw out not just the bad ones, but also the good ones, and I think there's going to be a pendulum swing back to a romantic kind of secularism. And with that, I believe we will see another rise, part 2 of the New Atheists. I believe this is probably coming in the next little bit. I'm not trying to be prophetic or anything. I'm just saying, just looking at the normal trends, this seems like what's going to come next. And so this book is a chance for us to go back through the arguments, see the overreaches from guys like Dawkins and the rest, kind of like going back again to a UFC fight where you already know the result and looking at the comment section that had happened beforehand and kind of seeing who was over their skis and stuff. It lets us see these arguments, see where they were overwrought, overborne, so that we're prepared as Christians for an answer. Because again, the culture, we want to basically understand how the gospel is relevant in this world. And here's the main thing I want us to understand as Christians. Lennox's point in God's Undertaker is not that Christianity and science are incompatible. It is not that there's any sort of war in these things. His argument is that most of the arguments from these new atheists were category errors. And the thing we talked about last week, and we're going to continue on to this week, but the main thing we did last week was distinguish between scientific evolution, which is something we can test in a lab and see, which is, we would call that perhaps microevolution. We could see adaptation and change. You can see survival of the fittest in many, many things. You can't see fruit flies, but we also see in science over and over again certain limits in this, right? Certain genetic limits to how much variation you actually see in these things. In other words, the mechanism that we see that we call microevolution, that mechanism that's working, is not able to bear the weight of the claim that mechanism is enough to talk about the origin of all things. Now, as a Christian, we're used to debating whether or not evolution is true. It's a losing debate. Well, what do we mean by evolution? What do we mean by true? What we would say is, I believe that microevolution, the thing we can see in a lab, is a reasonable thing to say, yeah, that's true. I think the doubt we have to be honest about is that the mechanism of microevolution can bear the weight being put upon it metaphysically from the new atheists. And so that's kind of what this chapter is getting to a little bit more, and we're going to deal with origins or biogenesis. And so you have biogenesis and the creation of life, and you have like abiogenesis, sort of the idea that everything came from nothing, and so on and so forth. So here's the chapter 7. I'm going to read through it. It's a shorter chapter. We're going to hit most of it, and then I'll read to you the paper I wrote, which is if you go to the app, on our app, under this teaching, there'll be a notes section. That paper you can print out. You can trade it like Pokemon cards. You can reread it, whatever you want to do. But I put work into this. so you can do what you want with it. So here it is. So a couple quotes. First, Stuart Kaufman said this: anyone who tells you that he or she knows how life started on Earth some 3.45 billion years ago is a fool or a knave. Nobody knows. Now, I personally I'm a young Earth guy, but regardless, that's neither here nor there. We have Anthony Flew saying it's become inordinately difficult even to begin to think about constructing a naturalistic theory of the evolution of that first reproducing organism. And so what we're trying to say is you can be, and some of you in this room are PhD level card-carrying, like hardcore scientists. We have many people at the top of their fields and all these things. I am not anti-science, neither is John Lennox himself a scientist. What I'm saying is the metaphysical claims wearing a lab coat need to be distinguished from the scientific claims, and we need to be honest about it. And so we're going to talk tonight, first of all, in this Origin of Life, about just the sheer complexity of the cell. And we have to remind ourselves that when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species again, cellular biology, molecular biology, wasn't even a field yet. Again, the cell was thought of as just a mass of goo, like a Lego or something, right? And so when you think of a Lego, it's not very complex. They're just building blocks and so on and so forth. A lot of evolutionary theory was just pure morphology. But here, listen to this. He says, our first objective in this chapter is to get some idea of the vast complexity of the living cell, and then to concentrate our attention on one aspect of it, the nature of the complexity of DNA. Now, why are we doing this? Well, according to geneticist Michael Denton, the break between the non-living and living world, quote, represents the most dramatic and fundamental of all the discontinuities of nature between a living cell and the most highly ordered non-biological systems, such as a crystal or a snowflake. There is a chasm as vast and absolute as it is possible to conceive. Again, if I said to you, how many rocks does it take to create a human being? You're like, it's just, you would recognize a category error. If I said, well, there's not an amount of rocks, I'm like, what if I gave you 10 rocks? Like, that's not the rock problem. Like, what if I gave you 10,000 rocks? You're like, the rocks aren't the problem, man. And they say, well, what if I had the right chemical composite, which we're going to get into. But the idea that the mechanistic evolution, that this mechanism being the basis for all life, has to see a complex ordering of things. And so the two debates we have is what the Bible says. It describes that mind becomes matter. God said, and it was so. You have a mind, immaterial mind, speaking matter into existence. And you might say, I don't believe in God, someone may say. I'm like, that's fine if you don't. But it makes more sense that mind could become matter. It happens all the time. We have things, thoughts, ideas, plans, and then the building is made. But the evolutionary idea, that macro sense, is saying that matter somehow becomes mind. And when we say this, someone will say, yes, this is settled science. And our argument needs to be, by what mechanism? Can you show me, help me out? I'd love to learn. Teach me what you want to teach me. I want you to be modest tonight. Because sometimes the mistake we make is, for example, let me just separate things for a minute. I'm going to talk about politics for a second. Listen, the easiest way for Republicans to do well in the midterms is to shut up and let the Democrats talk. Why? Because some of the things they're saying are very dumb. You've got, like I mentioned in Minnesota, and ICE, they didn't like ICE agents come in who they didn't know, so they made checkpoints, and I'm like, so you just invented borders. That's interesting. You had the story of Gavin Newsom just the other day going at Black History Month, speaking to an all-black audience, saying to the all-black audience, I'm just like you. I got 960 on my SATs and I can barely read. Google it. And the memes are ridiculous, making fun of his pandering. He's just obviously pandering, but in so doing becomes so racist and demeaning in what he says. So the reason I bring this up is, the worst thing you can do is that when someone's out over their skis, rescue them by arguing a subtle point. So for example, if you're ever talking to someone who's really manipulative in an argument, here's their tell. You're arguing something, you say, yesterday you were so mean because you spit in my soup and you threw this out, you do this thing, and you always do this other thing. And it's like, oh, you said always, every time? Like they can hint on that one thing that you overstated and just like let that be their whole point. The worst thing you can do is argue when someone's kind of like in trouble. And the evolutionary argument that you go from non-living to living cells, stop arguing this point, say, teach me. Stop saying, nuh-uh, be like, show me. What's going on? I need to know, all right? This is helpful. This is good. What do I mean by this? Even the tiniest of bacterial cells weighing less than a trillionth of a gram, so this is smaller than you can imagine, is a, quote, veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces for an intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms. That doesn't even sound like a real word. That sounds like a word that we just made up. How many? 100,000 million? That's a real word. It's made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms. Far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. Nothing's like it. Furthermore, according to Denton, there seems to be little evidence of evolution among cells. Isn't that an interesting? So when we talk about adaptation, change, we don't really even see a lot of that at the cellular level. What do we mean? Quote, molecular biology has also shown us that the basic design of the cell system is essentially the same in all living systems on Earth, from bacteria to mammals. In all organisms, the roles of DNA and mRNA and protein are identical. The meaning of the genetic code is also virtually identical in all cells. The size, structure, and component design of the protein synthetic machinery is practically the same in all cells. And again, any of you that are working at a biochemical level and a molecular level, you're like, you could do all these things and you can recognize mutation and adaptation. You can recognize all these things. But the size, structure, and component design of the protein synthetic machinery is practically the same in all cells. I'm sure this is something you could attest to. In terms of their best biochemical design, therefore, no living system can be thought of as being primitive or ancestral with respect to any other system. That's a big statement. Nor is there the slightest empirical hint of an evolutionary sequence among all the incredibly diverse cells on Earth. And so Denton, being a geneticist, that's his point of view. You might disagree with that, but that's a huge, staggering statement. This view is supported by Nobel Prize winner Jacques Monod, whom Denton cites. I say that when I can't pronounce their name. Quote, we have no idea what the structure of a primitive cell might have been. The simplest living system known to us, the bacterial cell, in its overall chemical plan, is the same as that of all other living beings. It employs the same genetic code and the same mechanism of translation as do, for example, human cells. In other words, when you get down to again, you go to Legoland and you're like, the dragon is made of the same thing as the boat. That's crazy. You're like, it is. It's because they're Legos. And the guys that designed the dragon and designed the boat used Legos to do it. That's kind of the picture. But the simplest cells available to us for study have nothing, quote unquote, primitive about them. No vestiges of truly primitive structures are discernible, unquote. Thus, the cells themselves exhibit a similar kind of stasis to that referred to in the previous chapter in connection with the fossil record. So again, why do I say all this? Well, you have to understand there's people that are really invested in different views, and what does this have to do with Jesus, right? Well, some things, but that's not my concern, okay? Tonight, what I want you to see is not, again, my goal is to never tell someone that knows more than me about a subject that they don't know what they're talking about. What are you talking about? They know more than me. I want to learn what they have to say. I want to be taught and educated. But what I want to make sure that isn't happening is that bait and switch. This is a big deal. For example, we've always underestimated cells, says Bruce Alberts, president of the National Academy of Science of the USA. The entire cell can be viewed as a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a set of large protein machines. Why do we call the large protein assemblies that underlie cell function protein machines? Precisely because, like machines invented by humans to deal efficiently with the macroscopic world, these protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts. It's hard for us to get any kind of picture of the seething, dizzyingly complex activity that occurs inside a living cell, which contains within its lipid membrane maybe 100 million proteins of 20,000 different types in one cell. And yet the whole cell is so tiny that a couple 100 of cells can be placed on the dot in the letter I on your paper right now. When you think of space as being infinitely large and you shrink it down, it goes truly to the infinitely small. The cell is restlessly productive as its many miniature assembly lines produce their unending quotas of protein machines. The existence of these exquisitely constituted molecular machines is powerful evidence for some scientists of a designing intelligence. And remember, the main argument we've been saying all along is that even Dawkins himself admits that the universe looks designed. And the question I constantly ask is it possible it looks designed because it is? Now, if they say, yes, that is possible, then great. We should all be open to that being possible. But their argument is not, yes, it's possible. The argument is not possible that it looks designed, but it's not possible that it is designed. It's like, why is that? Now, remember, there's no longer atheism that they're making. This is a claim that it is not possible that it's been designed. And what is the base of that? They're like, this mechanism that we have, proves that it's not. I'm like, wow, there's a lot of weight being borne by that mechanism. Tell me more about it. That's the game we're playing. So when we talk about these machines and whatnot, there's a guy, a biochemist named Michael Behe, who gets into a lot of trouble. He's a guy I mentioned before that some people really hate. He's a firebrand issue. I don't like to focus on him too much, but one example he gives of this idea of irreducible complexity is that of the tiny acid-driven motor discovered in 1973 that powers the bacterial flagellum, which is a propeller-like device that enables bacteria to swim. And he shows that this motor, which is so small that 35,000 laid end-to-end would take up only 1 millimeter, consists of some 40 protein parts, including a rotor, a stator, bushings, and a drive shaft. Behe argues that the absence of any one of these protein parts would result in complete loss of motor function. And you say to yourself, Matt, you said a lot of words. Oh, that sounds like a podcast. But I think I got lost. Well, how about this? What he's saying is the motor is irreducibly complex. It is a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. And he goes in to describe some examples of irreducible complexity, but the most famous example that's always used is a mousetrap. And here's why a mousetrap is so effective as an example. What is a mousetrap made up of? Let's just be really basic and say 3 parts, okay? Maybe more, but let's just say 3. You have a little piece of wood, then you have like a spring trap thing, right, that traps it, and you have cheese. Now, you could argue that you could get rid of the cheese and still you might catch mice. But the chances of that happening requires a mouse to just happen to coincidentally run through where the trap is and it just traps them, right? That's a kind of big statement. Essentially, if you just put cheese on a board, do you have a mousetrap? No. If you just have cheese with a spring sitting there, do you have a mousetrap? No. You need all 3 components to actually catch mice. You say, well, what if it caught mice before? I'm like, right, but I guess what's happening is the mechanism of natural selection, survival of the fittest, implies that for this thing to function and to develop, there needs to be like all 3 elements in the first place. You can't just start with anyone. In other words, the gradualist has a big mountain to overcome with things like irreducible complexity. And remember, we talked about this last week, the big debate in evolution prior to this was because of these irreducibly complex structures, many evolutionists became what I would call like punctuated equilibrium guys. They would be like rapid evolution guys. And so the gradualists were not popular for a long time. They just like had a big resurgence with guys like Dawkins in 2006. So this is what I think is coming back, and so let's just address it again, because it's really just a materialism. It's obvious that the existence of irreducibly complex biological machines would present a formidable challenge to evolutionary theory, as Darwin himself saw when he wrote, quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." That's what Darwin said. The point is repeated by Dawkins himself in The Blind Watchmaker, who says that if such an organism is found, he will, quote, cease to believe in Darwinism. Now, obviously, they're saying this because they think they have an answer. Behe responds to Darwin's challenge by arguing that there exist many irreducibly complex molecular machines, like the flagellum, right? Now, it's clear from the definition that establishing that any particular system is irreducibly complex involves proving a negative, and this is, as well known, notoriously difficult. Not surprisingly, therefore, Behe, who should be noted, doesn't really have any quarrel with Darwinian idea of descent with modification. He's an evolutionist himself, has provoked a storm of controversy because when he uses words like intelligent design, his whole point is evolution looks like it's something that exists in an intelligently designed universe, and that makes him the persona non grata. His claim is that molecular evolution isn't based on scientific authority. He quotes, quote, "There is no publication in the scientific literature, none, in prestigious journals, specialty journals, or books that describe how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. There are assertions that such evolution occurred, but absolutely none is supported by pertinent experiments or calculations, despite comparing sequences in mathematical modeling. Molecular evolution has never addressed the question of how complex structures came to be. In effect, the theory of Darwinian molecular evolution has not published, and so it should perish." That is a bold claim. James Shapiro, a biochemist at the University of Chicago, also admits that there are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. And there's nothing wrong with someone speculating. I want to make this really clear. Christian, the argument is not to take someone's speculation and say you're wrong. That's not the argument. That's not our job. The argument is to say, to help them understand and be comfortable with how much weight they're putting on their speculations. Does it make sense? Because if they're wrong and you're saying things don't look designed because you're putting a lot of weight on this thing, that's okay, you can do that. I just don't think this merits the kind of faith you're putting in it. It seems like it doesn't explain why you live the life you live, it doesn't explain why people act the way they act. Do you see how modest this is? That's the key. What I'm aiming for tonight is a bold modesty about these issues. Again, even the highly critical review of Behe by Cavalier Smith concedes that Behe's point that no detailed biochemical model exists. For Behe, the inadequacy of the neo-Darwinian synthesis consists in the fact that it cannot, even in principle, explain the origin of irreducible complexity. He argues that the existence of irreducible complexity at the molecular machine level points unmistakably to intelligent design. So last week I talked about it at the macro level. In other words, the whole picture of the giraffe with the thing that shunts the blood to its brain, so when a giraffe lowers its head to eat, the blood doesn't go rushing down and its brain explodes. It's hard to imagine this gradually, but those are big Lego pieces. At the cellular level, the complexity goes up in orders of magnitude. And so the argument is, what Behe's making is that the existence of irreducible complexity points to intelligent design. It just looks designed. This shouldn't be that controversial. And maybe someone says, well, I don't think it does. Well, okay, fine. You can have a debate about these things. The issue is that, no, this is settled. We can't even allow a divine foot in the door. Nor are we saying that this points to the Christian God of the Bible. That's not what we're saying at all. But let me get to that in a minute. In addition, Behe emphasizes that his conclusions are inferred naturally from data and not from sacred books or sectarian beliefs. They require no new principles of logic or science. They flow from the evidence provided by biochemistry combined with a consideration of the way in which we normally make design inference. Okay, so there's a big battle. But first, while the battle still rages over whether Behe has established his point or not, and in light of what's at stake, it's probably going to keep on raging, we turn to look at what lies behind, and this is so interesting, the complex structure of molecular machines. And this leads us at once to the question of the origin of life. Now, I'm not a biochemist. I did terrible in chemistry. The only real chemistry I know is the chemistry between me and my wife. That's all I can say. However, so if you're an expert in these fields, I just want to say at the front end, I'm reading to you from Lennox, but let me just establish a basic point here. The complexity that we're hearing about, most of us in our normal lives we just can't get our minds around what we're saying. That's all. It's more than what we think it is. That's all we're saying. Like, we look under a microscope when I was younger, I'm like, I don't remember. You saw squiggly things. Like, I never got to really, you know what I'm saying? You see the diagrams and stuff, but let's learn something for a minute and let's just see. So there are many different theories about the origin of life. Two of the most prominent are what's called the replicator first theory and the metabolism first scenario. So Richard Dawkins drew widespread attention to the first of these, the replicator picture, in his best-selling book, The Selfish Gene. Quote, "At some point, a particularly remarkable molecule was formed by accident. We will call it the replicator. It may not have been the biggest or most complex molecule around, but it had the extraordinary property of being able to create copies of itself." Unquote. Now, however, in the following, tonight, we'll see just how unlikely his claim really is, and that other models of origin of life have turned out to be in light of research done in the 30 years that have elapsed since that book was published. In other words, Dawkins' viewpoint sounds good, and as we've gotten more data, it sounds less good, if you want to say it that way. What do we mean? Well, molecular machines like the flagellum are made from proteins, which are in turn made out of what are often called the basic building blocks of living systems, which are amino acids, 20 of which occur in living organisms. One of the key questions in biology is, how did they arise? The famous Russian biochemist A.I. Oparin suggested in the 1920s that the atmosphere of the primeval Earth was composed essentially of methane, farts basically, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. So there you go. I'm sorry about the fart thing. I apologize. It's for my children. And that life had arisen as a result of chemical reactions occurring between this atmosphere and the chemicals found in the earth with the aid of ultraviolet radiation from the sun and other naturally occurring sources of energy such as lightning. Fascinatingly enough, in 1952, 22-year-old graduate student, that's pretty cool, 22-year-old dude did this, Stanley Miller conducted a famous experiment to test operant suggestion in the laboratory by passing electrical discharges through a chemical mixture simulating what was thought to be the atmosphere of the early Earth. After 2 days, Miller found a 2% yield of amino acids, and subsequent experimentation has produced all but one of the 20 amino acids necessary for life. This is a big statement. You mean to tell me if you just put those chemicals in a soup and you shock it right, you can get amino acids? Sounds like you've got everything you need. Such experiments were understandably hailed with great enthusiasm as a solution for the problem of life's origin. It seemed as if the building blocks of life could be relatively easily obtained by natural, unguided processes. And here's the part we've got to pause. If someone's in the sciences and these are the discoveries coming about, I want you to remind yourself that if you speak to someone who's saying that the science is really compelling and we're coming up with reasons to deny that God had to make special creation and they're pointing to these things, your first answer isn't to just deny the data. You might be like, it's very interesting to that person. But again, none of this goes against the gospel in any way. But even further, as the data doesn't point to it, people have to have the same reactions. In other words, you can't just pick the stuff you like and reject the stuff you don't. When the data goes the other way, are you willing to be excited about the other conclusions and go the other way? I think that's a fair solution. But regardless, the euphoria since that most time has subsided, obviously, in the face of subsequent major, and I say that with no grain of salt, major difficulties raised by deeper understanding of the chemistry involved in the first place. First of all, the consensus or opinion among geochemists as to the composition of the Earth's early atmosphere has changed. They now think that it did not contain significant amounts of ammonia, methane, or hydrogen that were needed to produce a strongly reducing atmosphere as required by the apparent hypothesis. But it was much more likely to have consisted of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. There's also evidence of significant amounts of free oxygen. And this alters the picture completely for their theoretical and practical reasons why amino acids couldn't be formed in such an atmosphere. And this has been confirmed experimentally. But even still, that's not even the issue. Suppose we wanted to make a protein that involves 100 amino acids. This would be a short protein. Most are at least 3 times as long. So just one amino acid, that involves 100 amino acids. Okay, that's how you get this protein. Amino acids exist in 2 chiral forms that are mirror images of each other, called L and D forms. Okay, so if you want to not pay attention for a minute, let me just finish reading this. These 2 forms appear in equal numbers in prebiotic simulation experiments. So that the probability of getting one or other of the form is roughly 1 out of 2. However, the great majority of the proteins found in nature contain only the L form. The probability of getting 100 amino acids of L form is therefore 1 over 2 in the 100 power, which is about 1 chance in 10 to the 30. That is 1 chance in 10 with 30 zeros. Like you can win the lottery a few times before you get to chances like that. So next, the amino acids have to be joined together. And it just gets into the probabilities get more and more. And then after that, they have to no more than half the bonds can be peptide bonds, and that probability goes up. And each one gets more. This is for a short chain amino acid for protein. I mean, this is crazy. Of course, a short protein is also much less complicated than the simplest cell. And for that, the probabilities become very much smaller. And he goes on, and he just talks about these probabilities and how crazy it is. Not only that, but physicist Paul Davies points out there are immense thermodynamic properties or problems in producing the peptide chains of amino acids. What do we mean by this? Well, the second law of thermodynamics describes the natural tendency of closed systems to degenerate, to lose information, order, and complexity. So I made a quote that went on a short, and I was joking around, but I said if you put a frog in a blender and you blend it up, after millions of years, you're not going to have an alligator come out. Well, that's people like, you're being so unfair to evolution, you're being so, okay, fine. But at least you're taking living cells and matter, and you have all the things in the soup. And my whole point is about entropy and breakdown. The idea is that things break down. That's the natural state of things. That doesn't mean other things don't happen, but that's thermodynamics. The idea of entropy, and systems tend to degenerate and lose information and complexity. That is to increase their entropy, and heat flows from hot to cold. Water flows downhill. Cars rust. You get out of shape, right? Your body is entropy right now. The second law is a statistical character. It doesn't absolutely forbid physical systems going against the flow uphill, but it does stack the odds very much against it. Davies says, quote, "It has been estimated that left to its own devices, a concentrated solution of amino acids would need a volume of fluid the size of the observable universe to go against the thermodynamic tide and create a single small polypeptide spontaneously. And again, that's not even starting with the frog in a blender, but regardless. Clearly, random molecular shuffling is of little use when the arrow of directionality points the wrong way. Again, the mechanism of putting the spoon in the soup to spell cat is also the same mechanism that when you put it back down, makes cat go away. All right? In addition, there's a major problem with time, since the time available for such random molecular shuffling to occur is much shorter than many people think. According to current estimates, there's relatively little time, less than 1 billion years after the formation of the Earth, for this to emerge. I mean, so this has to happen quickly. But even these difficulties, and they're major difficulties, are actually minor and trivial in comparison to what's by far the biggest problem of all, which is the way in which the proteins are built out of amino acids. Proteins aren't made simply by mixing the right amino acids together in the correct proportions. You can't just make a protein amino acid soup and you get something. You might mix an inorganic acid with an alkali to produce salt and water. Proteins are immensely specialized and intricate constructions of long chains of amino acid molecules and cannot be produced simply by injecting energy into the raw materials needed for their construction. Paul Davies puts it more graphically, quote, making a protein simply by injecting energy is rather like exploding a stick of dynamite under a pile of bricks and expecting it to form a house. You may liberate enough energy to raise the bricks, but without coupling the energy to the bricks in a controlled and ordered way, there is little hope of producing anything other than a chaotic mess. The mechanism of exploding the bricks is not a sufficient explanation for how you got the house, in other words. That's all we're saying. It's one thing to produce bricks, it's an entirely different thing to organize the building of a house or a factory. And he goes on and talks about this idea. I don't want to run out of time too much, but he keeps on going. It's only the start. The analogy of what we're describing here is bigger than just what we're saying. This guy named Karen Smith used an analogy of letters and words, and this is exactly right, since the crucial feature that characterizes proteins is that the amino acids which comprise them must be in exactly the right places in the chains, just like in a sentence, right? Think of the amino acids, the 20 letters of an alphabet, and then the protein is an incredibly long word in that alphabet in which every amino acid letter must be in the right place. That is, the order in which the amino acids are arranged in the chain is a vital thing. It's not simply the fact that they're there, just as the letters in a word or the keystrokes in a computer program must be in the correct order for the word to mean what it should mean or for the program to work. A single letter in the wrong place and the word could become another word or complete nonsense. A single incorrect keystroke in a computer program and it'll probably cease to function. Now, we're not used to that because we have spell check and your computer is like dumb proof, but the probability, for example, of getting 100 amino acids in the correct order would be 1 out of 20 to the 100th power, which is about 1 in 101 to the 30th power, which is, I just can't even, there's so many zeros there. 30 zeros, I mean, it's a lot. But that's only the start. Let me just say it's a lot, right? It's so much. It's only the start, and it's a very modest start at that. For these calculations are only talking about one single protein. Yet, life as we know it requires hundreds of thousands of proteins, and it's been calculated the odds against producing these by chance is more than 10 to the 40,000th to 1. That is 10 with 40,000 zeros after it. That's a lot of zeros. Sir Fred Hoyle famously compared these odds against the spontaneous formation of life with the chance of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and producing a Boeing 747 jet aircraft. And even that would be more likely. There's more other ideas. Some people talk about self-organization, but again, the issues that they try to keep showing in self-organization could work in some nature, but at the cellular level, it just falls apart. Order can be generated in some ways through chaotic means, but at the cellular level, it's just too much organization. Again, you could see someone splash paint on something and kind of create something that looks like that, but you just don't want a guy doing that in your lab, with beakers and things, Let me see. It's not just that it's completely impossible that sufficiently specific mineral catalysts, for example, exist for each of the reactions, the reverse of the citric acid cycle, but the chance of a full set of the catalysts occurring at a single locality on the primitive Earth in the absence of catalysts for disruptive side reactions seems remote in the extreme. Again, each thing is asking us really big statements. It's going over them. For example, at one point he said, why should one believe that an ensemble of minerals that are capable of catalyzing each other of the many steps of the reverse citric acid cycle was present anywhere on primitive Earth, or that the cycle mysteriously organized itself topographically on a metal sulfide surface? These are other people that are in the field. They're like, it's an absurd statement. The core problem of all of it that we got to get to is that even the processes, if they did occur against all odds that the chemists put in the way, these somehow give insight into the origin of life itself, eventually runs inevitably in the far greater difficulty that has to do with the nature of the complexity exhibited by the structure of the proteins that we mentioned at the end of the last section. What do we mean by that? The core problem is not that of producing the kind of order that is to be seen in a crystal or a honeycomb or even a Belousov-Zabutin, I don't even know how to say that, ski reaction. It's that of producing the qualitatively different language type of structures formed by the complex ordering of the amino acids that form a protein. What do I mean by that? It is not just pattern formation. It is, again, taking the letters and making a paragraph with punctuation. This is a very different, it's very obviously ordered. Again, it's a big deal. Paul Davies, again, says this: life is not actually an example of self-organization. Life is, in fact, specifies genetically directed organization. And he goes into this idea of internal control. Again, the idea that things look designed is key. Stephen Meyer puts the issue this way: self-organizational theorists explain well what doesn't need to be explained. What needs explained is not the origin of order, but the origin of information. If you're interested about this is a very big statement. This is where I'm the most fascinated by this. In other words, think materially. Again, bricks, apples, those are things. Information, plans, purposes, telos, design. Where did the information come? Again, when I write something to you, my mind has an idea. I'm putting it on symbols on a paper, and your mind reads those symbols. There's no energy produced by the thing on the paper. There's information that exists in a mind to another mind, receptors and the rest. It's a fascinating concept, the concept of information that lies at the heart of the problem, to the understanding of which we must now devote our attention for most of the rest of the book. So we're going to cover this the rest of the book. One of the most eminent scientists working in the origin of life, this guy named Leslie Orgel, summed up the position as follows: there are several tenable theories about the origin of organic material on the primitive earth, but in no case is the supporting evidence compelling. Right? I mean, that's the idea. Orgel there echoes the view of Klaus Doss, which is a great name, also a prominent worker in origin of life research, who 10 years earlier made the following assessment, quote, more than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than any solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or a confession of ignorance, unquote. Sir Francis Crick, not known to be sympathetic to the miraculous, nevertheless wrote, the origin of life seems almost to be a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. All of which leads one to think that the verdict of Stuart Kauffman of the Santa Fe Institute is valid. Quote, anyone who tells you that he or she knows how life started on Earth some 3.45 billion years ago, by this way, is a fool or a knave no one knows. More recently, Francis Collins has said the same, but how did self-replicating organisms arise in the first place? It is fair to say that at the present time, we simply do not know. No current hypothesis comes close to explaining any of this, right? And so we're going to get into it more, but the genetic code and its origin, it's worth spending our time on, but here's the paper that I wrote on the subject. I think it'll be helpful, and then I'll let you go. So, this isn't the one. Let me find it. It's here. Well, I had it in just a second. 1 second. Last time I lost it. Today I didn't lose it. Okay, I called this a pebble in the shoe. If you listen carefully, I think it'll help a little bit. A pebble in the shoe. The mechanism that requires more than mechanism. Here it is. Evolution, self-organization, the question we're not allowed to ask. The debate is not whether biological change occurs, but whether unguided self-organization is sufficient to account for the origin of life itself, and whether insisting that it must be science, insisting that it is, must be science or metaphysics. In other words, let's begin by removing caricatures. We want to not caricature the other side. Christians are not scandalized by adaptation, mutation, or natural selection. This is important. Variation within kinds, genetic change across generations, even dramatic speciation type events. None of these are really the central issue. The real question is, how did living, information-bearing, self-replicating cellular systems arise from non-living chemistry? Before natural selection can even operate, before you even have nature to select, you need a self-replicating system, information storage and transfer, functional protein machinery, coordinated metabolic pathways, membrane boundaries, error correction mechanisms. You need all of that. Natural selection explains differential survival of replicators, but it doesn't explain the origin of replication itself. And this isn't a small gap. It's the entire question. Okay, so here's the idea. The necessary claim they're making is self-organization. So for materialistic evolution to function as a total explanation of life, something massive must be assumed. Non-living matter must spontaneously self-organize into complex, information-rich, self-replicating systems. That is not a trivial claim. This is a metaphysical necessity for a worldview. Because if life requires intelligence, then materialism collapses. So the mechanism has to do the work, right? And here's where the illusion begins. We're often told this is, quote, settled science, but it isn't. There are hypotheses, RNA world, metabolism first models, as you said, lipid world models we didn't get into, hydrothermal vent scenarios we didn't get into. But no theory has experimentally demonstrated, that means using science in any way, a compelling, plausible pathway from chemistry to a fully functioning cell. This is not a God of the gaps argument, it's simply intellectual honesty. The origin of life remains unsolved in the lab. And let's go to the illusion of design. Evolutionary rhetoric frequently speaks of the illusion of design. Biological systems look designed, but they are not. They only appear so, we're told. So here's the philosophical move. If you begin with the premise that design is impossible, then anything that looks designed must be reinterpreted as non-design. The appearance has to be, in other words, explained away. But that's not neutral science, that's metaphysical filtering guiding the science you do. We've covered this again and again, but hear me again. Francis Schaeffer, I would use again, called this maneuver what it is, building your worldview on a metaphysical necessity and then labeling it science. He called it a form of semantic mysticism. When I say that, we use words that seem, semantic mysticism are words like design. Even when the blind watchmaker analogy, when he says blind processes, he'll say undirected process. These aren't terms, you never talk about your car being blind. To say blind gives the impression you're describing something that's non-human, but you don't use words like blind to describe non-human mechanisms. And so you're just kind of smuggling. There's a semantic mysticism in this. It's trying to reinterpret. It's trying to smuggle in through the rhetoric sort of persona. You start to capitalize nature. You start to capitalize evolution again and again. And so it's semantic mysticism. You're using scientific language to smuggle in philosophical commitments. If your worldview requires no creator, no transcendence, no telos, and no intelligence behind the universe, if your worldview requires it, then you have to assert that blind processes account for everything, no matter how absurd it seems. Even if the mechanism is unobserved, even if the pathway is hypothetical, even if the explanatory gap is getting bigger and bigger. In other words, the more we know, the more unlikely those views are, not the other way around. Their necessity isn't driven by data. It's driven by worldview. And this is where the confidence becomes baffling. This is what my whole point tonight is. The rhetoric that they're giving is exceeding the evidence. Why? Well, when critics dismiss arguments from design, when they say things look designed but they're not, and that's an absurd contention that they are, they treat them as purely religious claims. But design in biology is not first a religious inference. It's an inference from features of the data. Again, specified complexity, information coding systems, molecular machines like we talked about, flagellums, ATP, interdependent systems requiring coordination. Information is more than chemistry. DNA is not just a molecule, it is a coding system. And in every other domain of experience, information originates from mind. This isn't theology, this is just uniform human experience. To say that in this one case, information arose from non-intelligent processes is not an experimentally demonstrated fact, it's a hypothesis demanded by their worldview. Maybe it's even true, but why would we be compelled to assume it to be true? And that's what I'm trying to say, and here's where the press has to come in, and here's why I'm being so modest. Because I'm not making the big claim. You say, yes, you are, you're saying that God made everything. I'm like, okay, I'm saying that you said everything looks designed. I'm saying, maybe it looks designed because it's designed. You're the one saying, no, it's impossible. Help me out. What do I mean? The rejection of a creator, of a designer, is not scientifically demanded. It is philosophically chosen. And the insistence that evolution must account for everything, including the origin of life, doesn't come from an experiment. It's derived from a commitment to materialism. So why? Why that commitment? Well, we told you again and again each week, autonomy. Man wants to be like God without God. No one wants to be told that there's a creator that you're accountable to, that there's a design and a telos that you could be going against. If there's a creator, that means there's authority, and that's not you. And if there's authority, then your autonomy collapses. So there's a motivation. So the system has to exclude God because the microscope rules God out according to them. No, it doesn't. The will rules that out. So again, the choosing to be like God without God in the garden is just replicated in the field of science in this way. And this is why their confidence can feel religious. Their confidence that the science has settled. There is no God. There's no design at all. Why does that feel religious? Well, because it is religious. It's a faith commitment to a metaphysical naturalism, not demanded by science, but put upon it. So let me repeat myself very quickly tonight. I am not teaching a rejection of scientific investigation. I'm all for it. I'm not calling for a shutdown of experimentation in any way. I don't want us to retreat into any form of anti-intellectualism, ever. Christians should welcome research. If this Bible is true, if God is true, then it's true in the real world that actually exists with microscopes and telescopes and, I don't know, all kinds of scopes, I guess. But the issue isn't exploration. The issue is the claim that the mechanism must be sufficient. And nothing in science demands that conclusion. That's a worldview issue. That's why I'm so confident when I speak to people that are so much smarter than me, because they're in my world. For the believer in special creation, if you believe that God said and it was so, this isn't a checkmate argument that we're making. I want you to understand very clearly. There's many that you can make. This is a small argument. This is a domino effect. This is how I like to do jujitsu. This is how I like to argue. I like to make a small argument that leads you down a path that maybe you didn't want to go down. But it's just a small deviation. I want us all to be a little bit better at that. What do I mean? For the believer, special creation is not a checkmate argument. It is not triumphalism. It is a pebble in the shoe. If you're walking on a big day, I think, what's his name talked about this. You just take a pebble. If you ever want to annoy your wife, take a pebble, put it in her shoe. At some point, she's going to have to stop, and she's going to have to stop her whole life. She has to stop and take that dumb shoe off. Pebbles are annoying, but they're not catastrophic. You don't put a pebble in your shoe and go, ah! And explode, right? It's annoying. It rubs. It keeps annoying you, right? That's my desire. It's a pebble in the shoe. It simply says, I hear you. It just sounds like your confidence is exceeding the evidence. Pebble, shoe, anyways, have a good day. I understand your confidence. It just seems like your confidence is exceeding the evidence. Do you see how basic that is? You're not demeaning someone. You're not claiming expertise in something you don't know. You're like, and then when I say you don't even understand the evidence, I'm like, okay, from what I'm understanding, what you're explaining to me, treat me like a dummy. It doesn't see it. I don't feel compelled by any of the science you've shown me to reject a creator. It seems like you're making a worldview choice. And at once, if they see that, even a slight bit, if they start to doubt that why am I so confident in this? Well, the gospel story is no longer an absurd story. It's plausible. Now keep in mind, this is key. If the world is actually designed, all of a sudden revelation is possible. It means there's a designer. That means the argument that God actually wanted to communicate to us, that actually sent a son in his image, that he made us in his image, why would I reject that? I say all this, the reason I'm so comfortable with this is that, again, when I got saved, I've told you the story a million times, I want to remind you just one more time. The first thing that hit me when I heard the gospel wasn't a religious feeling. It was the realization that I had a motive in rejecting, at the outset, the gospel story. In other words, I had marginalized it. I'd put it in a category which was like a fairy tale, so I never really just heard it on its own terms. And once I was in a position to say, well, hold on, what actually makes it not true? And as I started arguing, I'm like, well, if there's a God, why wouldn't, I guess I'm struggling with this. Once you see even dimly, the goal is, this is key. right? If revelation is possible, Scripture isn't fantasy. If Scripture isn't fantasy, Christ isn't a myth. We know Christ was a real person. But my whole point is you're not trying to win arguments. All you're trying to do is expose someone's presupposition. That what they think is a scientific experiment, you're trying to break that roof down. So I understand you do science, but your commitment to this isn't a scientific commitment. The claim that unguided matter necessarily produced life isn't an experimentally demonstrated inevitability. It's a metaphysical commitment. Calling it settled science doesn't make it so. I wonder why you keep doing that. And recognizing that it doesn't make it science doesn't make you anti-science. It makes you honest about first principles, right? The real question is not whether evolution can explain adaptation. The real question is, why must it explain everything? And the answer to that question, again, isn't scientific, it's theological. And that's where the conversation actually begins, with a pebble, not a hammer. The goal is to expose confidence without attacking science. Give me 2 more minutes. You do not dismantle a confident atheist by lecturing, by saying, "Nuh-uh." You do it by asking questions. People know things, don't try to be the teacher. If someone's a teacher, listen to them. Don't even be hostile in your questions. Ask clarifying questions. And when you're not sure what they say to them, "It sounds like you're saying this, correct me if I'm wrong. Can you help me understand? I want to understand the position." Right? The goal is not to prove them wrong. The goal is to expose what their confidence is actually resting on. Where you can say, "Oh, I see what you're saying." And when someone confidently asserts evolution explains it, don't say, "Nuh-uh." Instead ask, "So do you think this hypothetical mechanism is more likely than design?" I'm like, "I do." I'm like, "Well, why is that?" In other words, I understand you think that this is enough to account for everything, but do you think that's a better answer than that's designed? That's the key move. You're not denying anything. You're just comparing 2 worldviews. You're not claiming certainty about a detailed mechanism of design. They're the ones claiming certainty that unguided matter did the job. They're the ones that are out over their skis. And so making them articulate why blind chemistry is more plausible than intelligence, stop getting in their way. Let them talk. Right? That's the whole quote. Let them talk. Let Newsom show his racism. Let them talk. And then gently respond with something like this. Well, at least they might respond rather to you with something like this, and you'll hear it all the time, and I hear it all the time. I'm not sure why you have such confidence in this. They'll say, "Well, at least it's better than believing in a sky daddy." And what's our next step? "Oh, yeah, well, you're ugly." Just pull back. Don't get defensive. Be like, "Why do you feel the need to say that?" "Because you religious type think you know that." "Oh, okay." I guess my point is, if design is rational, if things they do look design, why would you mock someone that thinks that they think there might be a designer? And if your rejection is scientific, why would you seem so personally affronted by it? I don't get super offended by people getting math questions wrong. Maybe math people in here do. I can't believe they did that integer, like that a bit. And asking a person, is your rejection scientific or personal? Purely scientific, I'm like, your tone doesn't seem like it is. Often, their rhetoric reveals their motive. If they were simply following the evidence, contempt would be totally unnecessary. Contempt usually signals a deeper commitment. Again, it's not enough to say we should not litter so much. We have to say the planet's going to burn down in 12 years. Remember when Thunberg said that 14 years ago? Well, that's a lot more sexy. The world's going to explode if you don't give me more power. Sounds a lot better than, maybe it'd be nicer if the ocean wasn't so gross. No. Ban straws. Okay. Contempt usually signals a deeper commitment. Because often the objection is not evidence forbids design, it's I refuse design. And those are not the same thing. Their mockery is not an argument, and you need to tell them that. I understand you're mocking my position. I'm just not sure where the argument is. You don't have to jump immediately to proving Christianity. If someone concedes that design is at least plausible, you don't need to force them into a Trinitarian theology on the spot. "Oh, so you think design is possible? Let me tell you about Jesus Christ." Just calm down. It is, however, appropriate to press their knowledge of the claims that they're so confidently rejecting. You seem really confident in your rejection of Jesus. Tell me about the Jesus you're rejecting. You're like, "I don't know anything about him." I'm like, "Then why are you rejecting him?" "Well, you don't know anything about Allah." I'm like, "I actually kind of do, but more importantly, I know something about Jesus. That's why I don't really know that much about Allah." So, do you know much about him? Have you examined his claims? Do you understand the claims he's actually made adequately? Someone said, "Well, we should Brett asked me on the podcast, he's like, do you think we should allow Palestinian immigrants because Jesus was a Palestinian immigrant? I'm like, anyone that's making that argument hasn't read the Bible. My whole point is, do you understand the claims of the Bible? You like the Bible because you're making that claim? Would you be willing to follow the Bible if it tells you that you need Jesus or you're going to hell? Like, that's a big deal. Have you examined the claims? Was Jesus a liar? Was he delusional? Was he telling the truth? What do you think? Most confident atheists have super strong feelings about Christianity, but very little familiarity with its actual claims. And they'll say things like, I've read the Bible. I'm like, oh, really? What's Romans about? Again, you're not attacking science. You're just probing their certainty. And hopefully exposing a bit of their ignorance, getting them to calm down. It's like, hey, it's okay for you not to know stuff. You don't like it if I come into your field. I haven't told you that you're wrong about your field. I'm saying what your field says isn't what you're saying. You get what I'm trying to say? You want to expose a bit of that. The quiet point in all of this is that their rejection of God isn't demanded by any science. It's grounded in a metaphysical commitment. I've said it again and again, and that commitment looks less like neutral reason and more like preference. Again, you're not trying to win. You're trying to place a pebble in the shoe of their certainty. And once certainty cracks, even slightly, the gospel becomes tenable, hearable. Not because you defeated science, but because you exposed the metaphysics hiding in the lab coat. The idea is simple. Once someone sees that their certainty isn't inevitable, that it rests on presupposition, the gospel is no longer absurd. It becomes at least possible. It becomes ideally something at least willing to be heard. And here's the key. Remember, it's not our arguments that win someone to Christ. It is the gospel. But our arguments can destroy strongholds, keeping people from even hearing it in the first place. Let's pray. God, thanks so much for this teaching. Thanks so much for John Lennox's book. But I just ask that each one of us here can be confident, gentle, not so stuck in the sort of like weird polarizing moment we're in. Help us to be winsome. And Father, so many people that are yelling at us today might be our brother and sister in Christ tomorrow. Help us to remember that, to be bold, never to be afraid. Light shines in the darkness doesn't overcome it, and we need to be bold ambassadors. We don't hide a light under the basket. We don't act like Christians in our private lives, but go into the public square and hide. The real world is your world, Father. And just even as the skies declare your handiwork and day to day pours forth speech and the heavens declare your glory, so too does the microscope, so too does the DNA, so too does the cell. Help us to be bold about these things, but modest about our claims. I just pray you'd use us, and I pray we see many skeptics come into this church and be saved. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week. God bless.